Hey there! Welcome to this week's message from Centralia Christian Church. We are so glad that you are listening, and we hope this message will encourage and inspire you to walk closer with Jesus. Now sit back, relax, and let's dive into the Word together.
We are in a series currently entitled Exodus, and we will conclude that series next week. And then the week after, we're going to start a series on prayer. And we're going to be going through the Lord's Prayer, and we're going to spend 6 weeks doing that and just digging into that a little bit. And it's called Pray Like Jesus. And so I'm looking forward to that, and I think we'll have some fun with that. And so get ready, keep praying, seek God, because He has something for us. Amen. But in case today inside your notes, one of the things that I've provided for you week in and week out is a study guide to kind of go along with the message. And usually there's one in the back, or you can look online and you can go to our website, and they're under Exodus Resources. You can find them all there. Or there's a nice little QR code that's sitting in your notes, and you can click that and you can go right there to a digital copy of that study guide. But I've been encouraging you guys to read through the book of Exodus and through the book of Numbers, because it provides a biblical account of God rescuing the Israelites from Egypt. Now, for those of you that maybe have missed previous weeks, you can watch online. You can look at our church app. If you don't have our church app downloaded, I encourage you to do that. You can find the messages there as well, and you can kind of go back and catch up on those previous weeks. So let's review for just a moment before we dive into something new, okay? The story of Exodus is not only a historical count, but it holds significant spiritual parallels for us today. The last 2 weeks we've been looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where the Apostle Paul says that these scriptures were written down for our what? Warning, or for our encouragement, right? There's lessons in the stories that resonate with us in the New Testament. For example, I was thinking about this. The Israelites were enslaved, okay? They were suffering. They were crying out to God, if you remember. And what did it said? God heard their cries, and He sent who? Starts with the M, ends with Oses. Moses, right? To go and to rescue them. And similarly, before we came to know Christ, we were in bondage to sin. We were in bondage to death. And so Moses had this very crucial task of revealing who God is. But just as Moses acted as a messenger, Jesus Christ is the ultimate representation of God. Amen? He came to show us the Father. And so when people began to understand this revelation, they realized their need for redemption. See, redemption initiates a journey that begins the moment that you and I are saved. And it leads us towards the promised land, which in this case represents heaven. And, we're currently on a journey. Every single one of us in this room is on a journey. We're on a journey to learn about God. We're on this journey to discover His nature. We're on this journey to learn how do I better trust and obey God. And just as the Israelites traveled through the desert to reach the promised land, we too are on a path filled with lessons of growth, right? Ultimately leading us to our heavenly home, our what? Promised land, okay? And so this story of Exodus is true. This story of Exodus is relevant to our lives this very moment. So if you want to explore, again, more of those details that maybe you've missed out on how that is, just revisit the previous week's messages and teachings, and you can get caught up with us. So this morning, though, I want you to remember that the journey you are on, whether you're just starting out or whether you've been a believer for some time, will likely experience unexpected detours, delays, and challenges. Have you ever noticed that your journey may be more winding than you ever anticipated? Anyone besides me, right? And many people and I all the time, they desire that our salvation, once we come to Christ and we accept Christ, that automatically we're transported to the promised land. But that's not how it works. Jesus warned us that we would face trials in this life. Did he not say that? And yet he reassured us to take heart because he has what? Overcome the... Do you believe that this morning? And so as I was thinking about this, we are indeed on a journey. Now, a significant aspect of the Exodus story is that upon their release, God did not lead the Israelites directly to the promised land. As a matter of fact, we talked about this last week, if God would have taken the most direct route to the promised land from Egypt, it would have only taken 11 to 12 days. That's it. And yet God chose a different route, right? He understood that if he went straight to the promised land, that they would encounter opposing armies that would cause them to panic and flee. And so instead, God guided them in a roundabout way, right? Leading them to the Red Sea, positioning them right against it. And naturally, if you look at this, the Israelites began to grumble, didn't they? And you remember what they continue to say through the book of Exodus? Where are we going? Who is leading us? You brought us out here to die. Now, they questioned God. They questioned Moses because the path seemed uncertain and not what they expected. However, God had his reasons for his decisions, didn't he? Right? And were the Israelites privy to those decisions? No. So my question is, were they really detours? Were they really delays? Or was it God knows what he's doing and just didn't tell us about it? See, I was thinking about this. He knew that they were not prepared for battle. He knew the formidable opposition that faced that direct route that they would have to go through. Second, God also anticipated that Pharaoh would change his mind and pursue them. And so God's plan was to lead them through the sea while simultaneously destroying the greatest army in the world at that moment in time. Because he wanted to show him, because Pharaoh thought he was a god, God was showing them that he's the true God. And while God had all of this figured out, the Israelites were left in the dark about his intentions. And oftentimes we look at the Israelites and we think, what a bunch of boneheads, right? That's the nice way of saying it. But aren't we guilty of the same thing when God doesn't take you and I on the most direct route that seems fastest and seems the easiest? Don't we complain? See, God doesn't reveal, or at least he doesn't always reveal his plans to us. He doesn't to me, does he to you? I don't know, right? But don't we often judge him based on our limited understanding? Think about that for a minute. Before I want to move forward in today's message, I want us to remember this. That God's plans are not our plans. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. He sees things that you and I cannot see. He knows factors that you and I are unaware of. He understands how each person will respond to whatever situation is in front of them. And our job as believers on this journey that we're on is to discover who he is and then learn to trust him. And so hopefully, we're following together and we're clear on that. But let's transition to Exodus 32. Okay? They cross the Red Sea. God leads the Israelites to Mount Sinai. He provides them with water and manna and quail along the way. They have fire by night, a cloud by day, guiding them directly to the mountain. They get to Mount Sinai, and God reveals to Moses that I'm going to come down and I'm going to speak to you in front of the people. And so Moses then instructed to tell the people, you need to sanctify yourself in preparation for God's arrival. And so for 3 days, it says that they got ready for this momentous occasion. And on the day that God was to speak, Moses steps out before the people who gather in front of their tents, and suddenly the mountain lights up with lightning and thunder, and it shakes violently, and it causes the people to panic. How many of you would panic if you were standing at the base of a mountain and thunder and lightning happened and it started quaking and it started shaking and you're just standing there? How many of you would freak out besides me? Good. Now, God calls Moses. Now, I don't know how he did it. He might have said, Moses, I don't know, right? But he calls Moses to ascend the mountain. And Moses obeys. He spends time with God. He receives various revelations from God while he's up on the mountain. And meanwhile, though, while he's doing that, the people remain at the base of the mountain, likely expecting Moses to return shortly. But it says days turn into weeks. Weeks eventually turn into 40 days. 40 days have passed without any sign of Moses coming down from the mountain whatsoever. All they know is that Moses is not back. As time drags on, people begin to react. And so Moses is up on the mountain, and again, while he's up on the mountain, I want to highlight this morning 3 groups of people and their responses to Moses' delay. Okay? Each group represents a different type of person. And I want you this morning I want to encourage you to be transparent with yourself. I want to encourage you to be self-aware. I want to encourage you to be humble at this moment before the Father and really look at which one of these groups of people resonate with you the most as you're sitting here today. Be honest. Deeply honest. Do you resonate better with the Israelite people, Aaron, Moses' brother, or Joshua? Now, one important thing to remember as we start walking into this is that when you're faced with our misconception of a detour, a delay, or a problem, it reveals your true character and the state of your faith. Would you agree with me on that? So when you're faced with whatever detour, delay, or problem, it reveals your true character and the state of your faith. See, it's parallel to me if I had a can of Coca-Cola. Any Pepsi people in here? Good, we wouldn't want to waste Pepsi. Okay, so anyway, so you take Coca-Cola and you just shake up a can of cola and you're just like, and then I was going to do this up here, I was going to put sheeting out and stuff, and then what would happen if you go, you would get hit with whatever was in it, whether it was good or bad, correct? See, the way you respond when life shakes you up reveals who you are, and it highlights what you need to address within yourself. And so I want to discuss the first character this morning, and the first character is the people. Okay? Now, Moses is on the mountain, and the Israelite people begin to grumble, thinking, God must have left us out here to die. Right? How many times do we remember, as we've walked through Exodus and Numbers, have they voiced that same sentiment? God's brought us out here to die. Where is he? Who is he? And so they question God's care. Right? They exclaim, where is our leader? And in their distress, you know what they do? They revert back to living in their past. They now glorify their past. Right? They reminisce and they say things like, well, back in Egypt, right, we had all the meat we could eat and we had all the food we wanted. Well, if it was so great, why were they crying out to God for salvation in the first place? Right? Because they conveniently forgotten the harsh realities of their past. See, I have a friend who is an alcoholic, and after several years of sobriety, I noticed that when he faced challenges he didn't understand, he was tempted to revert back to his old ways. He would think, well, since God has led me here, or maybe God's abandoned me, why not go back to drinking? He convinced himself. He says, well, it wasn't that bad, or I wasn't that messed up. Don't we do the same thing with our sin? Well, my sin wasn't that bad. Or my sin didn't really mess that up that bad. At least I'm better than Gabe. He's the only one I could pick on without maybe offending somebody, so you know. Right? And so, again, he had completely forgotten the pain and the chaos his addiction caused. Let me ask, have you ever done anything similar? You know, you might laugh about past experiences, right? Maybe saying something like, you know, when I was really drunk, this funny thing happened. You know, someone lit their hair on fire, whatever, I don't know, right? But you conveniently forget the 3 days of alcohol poisoning you had to deal with. You conveniently forget your broken relationships. You conveniently forget the trouble you got into. All you remember is the humorous, or what you perceived as a humorous moment, glorifying your past while ignoring the reasons you wanted to escape it in the first place. That's exactly what the Israelite people were doing. And as you read through Acts chapter 7, you'll find this powerful account from Luke and him referencing Moses. And so this morning, this is more, I'm just kind of telling a story today, but Acts chapter 7, verses 37 through 39, I want to read this to you, okay? And it says, this is the Moses who said to the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, it says, he received living oracles to give to us. And check out verse 39. It says, our fathers refused to obey him, but thrust him aside. Think about that word thrust. With extreme, right? And it says this, they thrust him aside, and in their hearts they turned to what? Egypt. What did they do? They turned back to the very place that they just escaped. How often do we find ourselves doing the same thing, right? When we're faced with tough times, right? And instead of holding on to our faith, instead of grabbing onto that, we revert back to our old ways. We revert back to our old wisdom. We revert back to what makes us comfortable, right? We might strive to be a godly man or a godly woman, maybe in our business or in our personal lives. But when a challenge arises, can't we just easily slip back into our old habits? You know, we rely on previous skill sets instead of trusting and holding on to God. See, it just amazes me that the Israelites were physically out of Egypt, but Egypt was still in their hearts. Where is Egypt in your heart right now? God's pulled us out of Egypt. But where is Egypt still in your heart? Where does it need to get rid of? Where do you need to work on that? Because here's what happens next. The people approached Aaron, Moses' brother, and they demanded, we want a God of our own. And so in response, Aaron instructed them, well, gather all the gold and all the silver you received from the Egyptians and bring it to me, and I'm going to melt it down and create an idol. Think about that for a moment. Who gave them all the gold and silver in the first place? Right? God did, didn't he? Yet, it was all, he blessed them from the plunder of Egypt. And yet, what did they do with those gifts? They used them to create what? An idol. Can I ask you a question? Will you be honest? Do you not see yourself right now on the pages of Exodus? Do you not see yourself right now in the story? Because they began to worship these gifts instead of the giver. Right? Because an idol at its core is anything we create based on our preferences and then choose to worship. So it says the Israelites fashioned a god according to their own likes and dislikes. Ultimately, what does it do? They're worshiping themselves, aren't they? Because if you fashion an idol with what you like and you don't like, it's about you. And here's the kicker. They grew impatient with God. They questioned his timing. They questioned the path that he had chosen, and they crafted a God that fit their desires. They reverted back to their old ways of worship, indulging in revelry and excess. Do you and I ever do that? Do we take the gifts that God has given us, like maybe a job or a relationship, and do we end up worshiping those gifts instead of God? Guilty. See, when we're faced with difficulty, and when the Israelites are faced with difficulty, they turned back to their old ways and they rejected God entirely. So that's the Israelite people. Character number 2 I want you to think about is Aaron, Moses' brother. Aaron had witnessed countless miracles, didn't he? He had saw what God did with Moses. They had saw all the things that Moses did, was a part of that. However, the people began to grumble about Moses' absence. And so what did Aaron do? He chose to compromise. The people outright rejected God, while Aaron compromised due to fear. He thought, if I don't go along with them, they might kill me. If I don't fit in, I'll be ostracized, or I could lose my position. Does that sound familiar? Out of fear, he melted down the gold and created a calf, justifying it by calling it what? Jehovah God. Have we ever done that? In our sin or in something else, where we take that and we try to justify it, calling it Jehovah God? Let me just be clear on one thing here. God does not want to be represented as a cow. He doesn't accept being worshiped in a form that diminishes his holiness. See, Aaron wanted to follow God, but also desired the approval of people. See, because he was willing to obey God only when it suited him. He compromised his faith when he was faced with challenges. So that's Aaron. Here's the third character, Joshua. Joshua would become later, he would become the leader of Israel. But Joshua sought to get as close to God as possible while Moses was on the mountain. Right? Joshua didn't ask, what's the least I can do to stay in God's good graces? Instead, he wanted to be near God. Even as others indulged in partying below, all of the people down there, no, he wanted to be close to God. And here's something interesting. As you remember reading through, there's a tent of meeting, right, where God would be, and Moses would go in to receive instructions from God as they're out on the desert, as they're out on the journey. And whenever Moses went to the tent, Joshua would always accompany him and sit just outside the tent door. He was eager to be close to God. Even after Moses left, Joshua remained there wanting to soak in the presence of God. And so while others compromised and gave up, Joshua remained faithful. And later, if you remember, when they get to the promised land and they send out the 12 spies, right, to scout the promised land, Joshua and Caleb, they returned with a positive report. Because why? They focused on the beauty of the land rather than the challenges posed by the inhabitants. But the other 10 spies, they were so consumed with fear. They were so consumed with doubt. They forgot God's power. And when people threatened to kill Joshua, when they threatened to kill Moses for their faith, God drastically intervened in that. Can I ask you a question? You can say no, but I'm still going to ask it anyway. I shouldn't say. Let me just clarify something here. What might have happened if Aaron had chosen to stand firm for God instead of succumbing to fear? What would have happened if Aaron would have chosen to stand firm for God and not succumb to fear. If God was willing to defend Joshua, don't you think God would have done the same for Aaron? I think he would have. But Aaron compromised. And as we reflect on the story, guys, we see here's these three categories of people. We see the Israelite people who grumbled and complained about everything, Aaron who compromised out of fear, and Joshua who remained faithful. I want you to imagine, though, the discomfort Joshua experienced during those 40 days staying close to God while everyone else was partying. Let me ask you a question. Was it easy for Moses to be with God on the mountain? Why don't you think about that for a minute? I don't think it was. Because here's what I've learned in my life. Being in God's presence doesn't guarantee comfort. In fact, stepping out in faith often means stepping out of our comfort zones. And so instead of giving in or quitting or compromising, Moses and Joshua, they endured discomfort because they wanted to know God and be used by God. How willing are you to be uncomfortable so that you can know God and be used by God? They desired to enter the promised land, not just to reach it, but to go with God. Because here's something, the promised land without the promised one isn't truly the promised land. The promised land without the promised one isn't truly the promised land at all. Right? You know, I talked about this first service. I don't want heaven without God because He is what makes heaven heaven. Right? These men were learning to know and to trust God. It's relationship that makes heaven heaven. And so, as we continue to explore the story, church, it's fascinating to note that while Moses was on the mountain spending time with God, Joshua was positioned about halfway down. And God speaks to Moses and He says, Moses, the people you brought out of Egypt are down there worshiping an idol and partying. Now I thought, why would God put that on there? And it struck me is that the Israelites are gathered at the bottom of the hill of the mountain. They are completely oblivious to God's awareness of their actions. They think that they can indulge without consequences while God is fully aware of everything that's happening below. I think that's interesting. The implications of their actions are very profound, church. You know, you might have expected that as soon as they started and began their carousing, their partying, that God would have struck them down. But what's interesting is God allowed them to continue. And this reflects a reality that many Christians face today. Many Christians face this today. We know what God desires for us. But when His timing doesn't align with our own expectations, we often choose to go our own way. We might think that because God isn't acting the way that we want Him to act, that He doesn't see our actions. But the Bible teaches that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of what? Wisdom. We can easily fall into this trap of ignoring His presence while we pursue our own desires. So we pursue our own desires down here thinking that God doesn't even see what's happening, or does He really see what's happening? No, God saw what was happening. He wasn't oblivious to any of it. He just chose not to act on it at that moment. See, when God sends Moses down the mountain, Moses takes several actions in the name of the Lord. First, he disciplines the people. Eventually, God makes it very clear that none of that generation will enter the promised land. And He leads them to wander for 40 years. 40 is a big number in the Bible. Could it be 1 year for every day Moses was on the mountain? Maybe. But 40 is kind of a big thing. But here's the deal. The entire generation, due to their constant rebellion, died scattered in the desert. You know, as I reflect on the impact of their decisions, I am struck by the fact that Moses, Caleb, and Joshua did the right thing and yet still had to endure 40 years in the desert as a result of someone else's actions. Which brings me to a very important application, that our choice affects one another. Our choices affect one another. Your decisions impact someone else's journey, and their decisions influences yours. So when you were called to be a believer, you were called to be a part of the people of God. Moses understood that his mission was to lead. It was to serve the people. Not just to have a personal relationship with God. Some of you may have thought, and I hear this a lot, I just want it to be Jesus and me. I just want it to be me and Jesus. But that's not a biblical model. We're called to be a part of the family of God, the body of Christ, and we journey together. What you do affects me, and what I do affects you. And it ultimately impacts the glory of God. So in the story, we see those three individuals. We see Moses, we see Caleb, we see Joshua. They obeyed the Lord, but they did not enter the promised land directly. They were faithful amidst adversity. Many of you in this room have chosen, and as you're watching online, have chosen to follow God. Yet others' decisions have impacted your journey. Right? Because I know that there's women in this room whose husbands made commitments but later walked away, leaving them to raise children in a very challenging circumstance. There are men here who have faced the pain of a spouse leaving. We have some business people who have tried to operate ethically only to be affected by unethical partners. Others have experienced church splits despite their desire to be godly. And so, church, in these situations, it's natural to wonder, God, what are you doing? Where are you? What are you doing, God? And here's the thing. Yes, your journey may be longer, and you may feel tempted to give up, but remember this. If you don't get anything else out of today, remember this. Faithfulness leads to the promised land. Faithfulness leads to the promised land. It may not happen in your timeline, but Joshua and Caleb eventually entered the promised land because they understood that their commitment to God was also a commitment to his people. Did you catch that? Our commitment to God is also a commitment to each other. See, their lives were meant to glorify God and benefit others. Did you know that your life is meant to glorify God and benefit others? See, during those 40 years, instead of getting angry with God and complaining about the stubbornness of the people, which I would have, that's why I wasn't alive then, right? Joshua and Caleb said, God, use me to help these people. Because they realized that if God had removed them from the situation, there would be no godly influence on the next generation. Right? Their presence was crucial for shaping the future of those who would enter into the promised land. Our faithfulness is crucial for the next generation. It's crucial for them to hear so they can enter the promised land. And see, when we're faced with consequences of others' decisions, it's easy to become like Aaron. It's easy to become like the Israelite people. Right? It's easy to lose trust in God who sees us and knows us. But remember, your faithfulness is significant in the story of God. Did you know that? Your faithfulness is significant in the story of this church. Your faithfulness is significant in this moment. And God can use your journey, even the difficult parts, to influence others and bring about his purpose. So I want to wrap up and I want to visit 2 points. Revisit 2 key points here. One, the journey includes what we perceive as detours and delays. Would you agree that your journey has come with unexpected, windy delays and detours, or didn't go the way that you wanted it to go? It's essential to remember that God knows what he's doing even in those times. When we encounter these delays, it's easy to become impatient. It's easy to grumble. It is easy to even quit. Much like the Israelites did, by the way. Or to compromise our faith like Aaron did. But instead, you and I are called to emulate Joshua, who remained steadfast, knowing that God sees us, God knows us, and did you know this? God genuinely cares for you. Each one of us in this room. Each one of you watching online. And second is faithfulness, having faithfulness amidst others' decisions. We're impacted by others' decisions. Yet you and I still have the opportunity to be faithful to God, amen? And in those challenging situations, we can be the source of light in the darkness, right? Our unwavering faithfulness, even in the face of adversity, can draw others to us that would ultimately lead them to Christ. And so I just want to encourage you. Let's strive to be like Joshua, right? Let's trust God's plan. Let's be a positive influence in our communities. Because God knows what he's doing. And God may not be taking us the most direct route because he knows what's best for us. Do you trust that this morning? Would you pray with me?
We would like to thank you for spending part of your day here with us. Our mission here at Centralia Christian Church is to help people build full-time relationships with Jesus. If you would like more info on the ministry or giving opportunities, visit us online at www.centraliachristian.org.